Welcome, everyone, and thanks Valeria and Dianoja and others, MintLab affiliates, for joining us today. I will summarize the general objective and general findings of our project, but before moving on this, I will briefly clarify what we mean by morality, the term morality. Actually, the definition of morality in moral philosophy mean many different things, and it can mean normative ethic, applied ethic, and meta-ethic. Actually, when most people use the term morality, they actually use normative ethics, the normative principles regarding what is right and wrong. And the most well-known normative ethical principles are utilitarianism and deontology. A standard utilitarian might say that it is the moral right behavior to maximize the greater good, whereas a deontologist focus on violating already existing social norms, such as do not kill anyone, regardless of the consequences. And in moral psychology, there are also some rival theories which try to describe what lay notions of morality are, and what are the core moral values people apply to different circumstances. One of them is well-known moral foundations theory, and another one maybe morality is cooperation theory, and their definition of morality differ from each other in some, and they are similar in some sense, but they differ from important definitions, such as one of them use individualizing or universalizing foundations of care and fairness, while the other one binding foundations, which means loyalty, authority, and sanctity. But in morality as cooperation, there is a completely different definitions of morality, which was defined based on game theoretical cooperation problems, such as reciprocity. And they categorize moral foundations as family, group, fairness, reciprocity, heroism, deference, and property. Applied ethics are actually daily application of those normative ethical principles, such as when you support or oppose euthanasia, actually you have some normative principle underlying this applied ethical decision. For example, if you believe that euthanasia should not be legal and it's not morally right, you are more likely to believe in the endorsement of sanctity, purity, foundations. As the Bible says, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. In contrast, if you are supporting euthanasia, you probably believe the individual autonomy to control one's life. So actually, in such everyday decisions, there are some normative ethical principles behind these daily decisions. So in economic games, incentivized economic games, we actually measure some applied ethical decision. For example, in a dictator game, when you behave generously, actually probably you are endorsing fairness more than other foundations. So that's why some fields, such as behavioral economics, uses economic games to define moral behaviors from the applied ethical perspective, while social psychologists or political psychologists or moral psychologists mostly use intention measures to define, to operationalize those kinds of applied ethical principles. And there is also meta-ethics in the moral philosophy. It is like a bird's eye view of morality. What are the origins of morality? Like, for example, if you believe that God is the author of moral truths, it is actually a meta-ethical belief. Morality is founded on a divine authority. And which, of course, challenges some individual theories regarding the sources of morality, because if you believe that God is the source of morality, there is little room for questioning, individual questioning. So this is also one of the implications of this meta-ethical belief. And there are also other meta-ethical beliefs, such as objective and subjective morality. For example, you can support euthanasia, but you can also think that it is a subjective position. Regardless, it depends on context or culture. So it is not an absolute moral rule. But if you believe that euthanasia is absolutely true in every circumstances, you are actually more likely to support moral objectivism. And in our project, we actually used all of these definitions all together to define different aspects of moral behavior and moral intentions. And mainly, in the first phase, we try to understand whether believers are morally more consistent in these different aspects of moral behavior and moral intentions compared to non-believers. And in the second phase, we try to imply causality, and in order to do that, we had to develop some innovative experimental techniques to prime both religiosity and secular authorities, because in the past literature, there were some problems regarding their effectiveness. And in the third phase, after we developed our techniques, we tried to imply causality. We primed religious and secular authorities and looked at different moral behaviors and intentions in separate experiments. And mainly, as intentions measures, in our study, we use moral foundations questionnaire, moralities cooperation questionnaire, and meta-ethical questionnaire, which are used to measure these meta-ethical principles, objective and subjective morality, and morality is founded on a divine authority. And for the actual moral behaviors, we measured several different aspects of moral behavior, such as honesty, such as generosity, cooperation, trust, trustworthiness, norm enforcement, also known as third-party punishment, and moral courage. And moral courage actually means, in our project, it's a standard third-party punishment game with a possibility of retaliation. So it is called moral courage in our project. And we also tested some of the alternative underlying mechanisms of, if we find a moral consistency, what is driving this consistency. So we evaluated different alternative possibilities based on our proto-theory of religion as moral compass. So our main idea is actually religion can be a moral compass which guides people to behave differently, behave similarly across different circumstances, regardless of the situation. Because, for example, there are 10 commandments, or there are some holy books teachings, and there are some social norms. And people internalize these social norms, and they can intuitively apply these norms into different circumstances, regardless of this situation, regardless of the contextual cues. So that's why, according to this initial prediction, moral behaviors, believers should behave morally more consistently across different moral situations, if it is a moral compass and if it guides their future behavior. Because religious beliefs are not only shaping personal norms, individuals' personal norms, it also shapes how people will behave in different circumstances when there is uncertainty. So that's why we evaluated different underlying mechanisms, why there should be a moral consistency among believers, because they are more likely to follow rules, conformity, or they are more likely to endorse deontological principles of rules, do not violate any social norm or relevant social norms. Or their intuitive-based thinking style can also mediate or moderate this kind of association. You will hear the details of all of these research throughout the day, so I am just making a brief summary to give a framework for you. And in part A, the co-director of this project, Ozan İşler, will summarize in detail. We had 3 waves, and the last 2 waves were longitudinal. And in the first wave, because of the length of the surveys, we divided survey measurements and economic gain measurement into 2. So we measured several potential moderators, such as moral values of moralities, cooperation, etc., such as both performance-based and self-reported cognitive style measures of intuition and reflection. We also measure different kinds of religiosity, etc. And 7 months later, we reinvited the same participants and again measured their actual moral behaviors of donation, public goods game, trust game, dictator game, third-party punishment, moral courage, and conformity. And we actually applied a factor analysis approach here to classify different economic games, responses to given different economic games, in order to calculate an overall pro-sociality score, which we used as the average of donation, public goods game, and trust game. So when we mean pro-sociality in this project, it is actually the average of donation task, public goods game, and trust game, which was found valid in our research. And 11 months later, we also measured the same economic games, plus a monetary dilemma game, which attempts to measure deontological or utilitarian behaviors, not intentions. And in the second phase, of course, all of those research were correlational, although it has some longitudinal part. In order to imply causality, we had to develop some novel methods to prime religiosity and secular authorities. Because in the previous literature, there were some problems with the explicit prime, like think about God. When you say think about God, actually it activates demand characteristics, experimental demand effects, or social desirability effects. That's why it's not clear what they are causing, actually. But when we look at the implicit prime, so they are ineffective. They were found to be ineffective in the previous literature. That's why we developed a supraliminal prime, which means in between implicit and explicit prime. For example, in online platforms, people always encounter with such CAPTCHA task. So this is a visual identification task. We developed several of these, and this is the most effective ones as examples. And this is standard CAPTCHA task. And in a CAPTCHA task, we are asking, please, to continue, select one keyword that best describes the image. So it is justice in the secular prime condition, and it is sacred in the religious prime condition. So one of them is writing Holy Bible, and another one is the law. So the argument is simple. The participants are seeing, are aware of the stimuli, like in the explicit prime, but they are not aware of it is a religious priming technique. They thought that this is just an attention check question. It is very common in the online platforms, such as we always use such CAPTCHA tasks in order to distinguish human and bot activity in Amazon Mechanical Turk-like platforms. So that's why those kinds of participants are very familiar with such attention check questions. That's why it is called supraliminal. It is not implicit, it is explicit, but it is supraliminal between implicit and explicit prime. So their goals are different. We also had to develop a word completion task to test their effect, to understand whether the saliency of religious prime and secular primes activates really the relevant concepts. For example, when we prime religiosity, the concepts related to religiosity should be salient on people's minds, should be accessible. But when we look at the previous literature, although religious primes were very popular, nobody systematically tested their effectiveness, their validity. So that's why we didn't find any word completion task designed for this purpose. That's why we had to design from the scratch. And in phase 3, after we validated our experimental manipulations, we tested their effectiveness on different moral behaviors in separate experiments. For example, in one of the experiments, we tested their effectiveness on generosity, in some of them on punishment, in another one on moral consistency. And in some of those experiments, we also tested some of the moderators, such as group identity, whether their effects would differ when the participants, the target participants, interactive participant is in group or out group. And we also tested potential underlying mechanisms such as conformity and deontology. And our lab manager, Ensar Ecem, will summarize you the phase 2 and phase 3 findings all together, because their methodologies are very similar to each other. Because our IVs are always religious priming or secular priming, and our DVs are moral behaviors or moral consistency in each experiment. And when we look at the general findings, as just a summary, as I said, you will hear more about the details of all of these research, or most of this research, throughout today. And we show that believers show higher consistency in moral behaviors and in some moral intentions. For example, in group-based foundations, religious believers found to be more consistent, whereas in individualizing or universalizing foundations, non-believers were found to be more consistent. But when we look at the actual behavior, actual pro-social behavior, we found no overall difference between believers and non-believers on our pro-sociality measure. But believers donated more and punished non-violators more than non-believers. And a stronger rule-following tendency, which we call conformity, is actually the key driver in this moral consistency. And in phase 2, we validated our experimental manipulation by showing that using those primes and successfully activates relevant concept in people's mind without activating social desirability biases. We compared the effectiveness of this technique with that of the explicit techniques, for example, which were also found to be successful. And in phase 3, in contrast to our initial hypothesis, we didn't find any significant effect of religious priming on moral consistency. But more importantly, and in line with our pre-registered hypothesis, all of these research were pre-registered, by the way, in line with our hypothesis, secular prime increased moral consistency among both believers and non-believers, so which is very interesting. And we replicated our initial hypothesis that believers are more generous in only donation tasks, but there is no other differences in the overall pro-sociality measure. And we also replicated the finding that believers punish non-violators more and more consistently across anonymous in and out groups, while non-believers punish their out groups more than their in groups. So this is one of the interesting findings here. And more interestingly, religious prime significantly decreased punishment behavior, which can be explained by compensatory control mechanism actually, because religious prime can activate fear of supernatural punishment. So when there is a divine punishment possibility, actually you are less likely to intervene in the earthly punishment because there is a trade-off, there is a hydraulic relationship between this. When divine punishment is possible, people are less likely to punish according to this compensatory control mechanism theory. And you will hear more of this in the presentations. And we also had a chance to investigate other relevant theoretical questions in our phase 1 because we conducted 3-way research. We had a chance to investigate by pre-registering our hypotheses to say about seemingly different theoretical questions, such as Green's dual process model of moral judgment. It basically argues that cognitive reflection is associated and will lead to utilitarianism, but little is known about their relationship with cognitive reflection's relationship with utilitarian behavior. So in part A, we measured different versions of cognitive reflection tests, both performance and self-reported. And we also measured Oxford utilitarianism scale, which has a 2 subscale. One of them is impartial beneficence, and the other one is instrumental harm. So impartial beneficence is actually what most people understand when they say utilitarianism. It is like impartiality. And in part C, we had a monetary dilemma game. It is a measure of utilitarian behavior. And we also asked their justification, why their motivations. Why did you choose that option? And there were some different moral philosophical questions, such as utilitarianism. I chose this response because my goal was to maximize the greater good. So this is an example item for utilitarianism. And there were relevant items for deontology, virtue ethics, and fatalism. And there were also a moral motivation. So no moral motivation involved here. So when we look at the correlations, there were no relationship between cognitive reflection and Oxford utilitarianism scale, but cognitive reflection after 17 months predicted utilitarian behavior. So this is the first important finding. But Oxford utilitarianism scale did not predict utilitarian behavior. But more importantly, when we look at correlations between justifications, impartial beneficence were positively associated with all of the moral items. So it is like a moralism or moralizing or moral sensitivity measure rather than a utilitarianism measure, because it is not able to distinguish between utilitarian and other seemingly opposite moral philosophies. But when we look at monetary dilemma game decisions, utilitarian decisions was only positively correlated with utilitarianism, and it was negatively correlated with deontology, virtue ethics, and fatalism. And these justifications were also used in our previous research, so we know that they are working. That's why there should be something wrong with the validity of Oxford utilitarianism scale, which was our one of the general findings here. And Rosalind Vurgun, our project coordinator, will present this work. It is also her MA thesis. And İlayda Velioğlu, one of our PhD students, will summarize another pre-registered research. We also had a chance to compare intention and behavioral measures, whether there is any intention and behavior gap in people's hypothetical decisions and incentivized decisions. And in part A, we measured hypothetical dictator game and hypothetical money allocation game. And among the same participants, at part B, we also tested incentivized dictator game and incentivized money allocation game. And although we found an intention behavior gap in line with the previous literature, people's reported intentions were higher than their actual behavior, we found these intention behavior gap were identical among believers and non-believers. So we did not find any significant interaction with the religious affiliation, in contrast to a recent meta-analysis. And we also had a chance to look at or conduct several other pre-registered research, because there is a dearth of empirical investigation for such questions. For example, we try to understand whether cognitive reflection predicts cooperation 7 months later, or meta-ethics predict diverse moral behaviors, or cognitive reflection test is used as cognitive decoupling or attitude change or motivated reasoning. Because some people use reflection to justify their initial intuitive position, depending on their moral preferences and their epistemic norms, criteria for the sources of knowledge. So that's why we also tested these possibilities when people are more likely to use cognitive reflection for motivated reasoning and cognitive decoupling. And we also, morality cooperation theory has a prediction that all of those endorsements of morality should be positively correlated with cooperation. But little is known about how these intentional measures predict actual cooperative behavior. That's why we had a chance to look at this. And we also argued that religious believers more likely to perceive anonymous participants in the economic games more similar to their in-groups. So that's why maybe in some research, because religious believers exhibit more prosocial behavior, is due to their perception of anonymous group participants. Because if they perceive them as more similar to their in-groups, they are more likely to give more money to them. But nobody looked at this as far as we know. That's why we also looked at this, and we found some evidence. Really, they perceive anonymous participants commonly used in economic games as more similar to their in-groups compared to non-believers. So that's why maybe some increased prosocial behaviors can be partly explained by these perceptions. So that's why you will not hear more about these adjacent projects, but you will hear more about our main projects. So this is just a brief summary, and I will invite Valeria for his groundbreaking meta-analysis and for presenting his novel theory, generalized social heuristics model. Thank you.